Welcome everybody to the keynote lecture of the Garages, Kitchens and Hackerspaces conference. So I want to thank again Steve Shapin for agreeing to come to St. Petersburg and deliver this lecture. My presentation, my introduction of Steve is going to be minimalist. You know very well who Steve is and many of his works. One thing that we can say retrospectively, though of course unfortunately betraying age that kicks in, is that looking back, Leviathan and the Air Pump, it seems to me at least it's the most influential book in the history of science of my generation and probably well beyond that. And also it's a book that has managed to cross over, it's a book that has had a huge impact both in the history of science of STS, which is a particularly important achievement given the fact that these two fields, despite the fact that they have claimed to be related since the beginning, they are not. Although I am deeply suspicious of notions such as breakthrough, revolutions, blah, 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 I just want to relate, again, to display my age, I want to relay a little anecdote that is triggered by Steve's remark yesterday that, we met in the distant 19, right? It was 1985 at the International Congress of History of Science at Berkeley. Steve and Simon Schaffer were giving papers based on Leviathan and the Air Pump. And Steve seemed to remember that I asked kind of a rambling, nonsensical question or something of the sort, which is probably true because I actually did not understand what these guys were talking about. In the technical sense, they're coming from having been trained in the kind of Kuhnian Feyerabend tradition where everything is about theories, concepts, and so on. The fact that these guys were talking about practices, experiments, and doing this weird thing, the experimental regressors, I had no idea what they were talking about. And you understand, I was not a hostile listener because it was pretty clear that they were pissing off my bosses, which was a very good thing. So I was prone to like these guys precisely because of the effects that they seem to be having on the other historians of science, but I couldn't really understand. So I mean it as a good thing. They did really make us think differently. The next work that is actually work that I have engaged quite a bit because Steve and I have been working on similar topics on different materials is a social history of truth, where he has expanded some of the things that were already in the Leviathan and the Air Pump, but to full articulation, namely the inherent, the necessary role of politeness, civility, politeness of interaction, argumentation, writing, and the self-presentation in a manner that conveys something like virtue. So then, after that, I thought that Steve took a very strange turn. When he started trying to find moments of places of virtue in contemporary technoscience, I thought he had lost it. I thought that, I could not understand how one could go from the kind of scenarios that you encountered in 17th century sciences, personal interactions face-to-face, small groups, to, a completely different scenarios. And instead, a scientific life showed that he got it right. And I think that this afternoon we're going to hear something about virtue at Bucks or something like that. Meaning, it's breakfast at Bucks, but about the kind of things that happen in close personal interaction, in this case, in a restaurant that I'm told is pretty bad, right? Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for being here.
Thank you, Mario, for that very kind introduction. Perhaps we can round off our relationship by you not understanding this one either, in which case you will not be alone. I was once given some very good advice. Never apologize when you're about to give a talk. Certainly never apologize after you've given. So I'm going to make two apologies. Don't have to make an apology. The first is I was told this was a keynote address in the Golden Hall. And so I prepared, as apparently no one else has, an actual old-fashioned talk, which I'll try to massage by extracting from it. But my apologies for that. I also have slightly more time to fill because of the keynote than other people have had. The other apology came as a surprise because I've been fascinated with these talks about hacker spaces and cafes, and you may think at the end of the time that I'm taking that I've not talked about spaces of innovation, in which case I'm going to try to defend myself, but it's a very different space than the one we've been hearing about. And anyway, I hope there's a certain amount of light relief. I think this is a serious piece, but there's some quite odd and funny things that happen along the way. There's a place in Silicon Valley that's become famous for the deals that have been done there. By some estimates, $8 billion of deals have been done involving the form of private financing known as venture capital or angel investment committed to techno-scientific enterprises, furthering someone's dream of turning an idea into a commercial reality. So just as there's no high-tech or biotech business without financing, without capital, so there's no high-tech or biotech business without someone coming up with an idea. So these entities, the idea and the sources of capital embodied, have got to come together at some point in the relationship, or else you have no Silicon Valley. And sometimes, in fact, sometimes always, they come together face to face. So this is something that Mario picked up in the Social History of Truth book and in the Scientific Life. I am concerned with the face to face, hence the intimacy of that title. Now, of course, it's problematic to assign any one techno-scientific enterprise to a specific time and space. Garages, as we haven't quite yet heard, actual garages and kitchens are iconic sites in which ideas are turned into prototypes, if not into commercial realities. Pitches are presented at VC offices. Forms are signed in lawyers' conference rooms. But some places really become iconic or mythic, as I think Mario is going to say, about the place where things started. These are origin myths, grounded in some substantial reality that I want to talk about where things begin. Now, the deals which are assigned to this particular place amount, as I said, to billions of dollars. No one's done an actual count. Anyway, lots of tourists now come and journalists now come from throughout the world to this place in the hopes of seeing some famous geek or some famous venture capitalist, or at least seeing the place where a famous geek and a famous venture capitalist met. So it's a place a little bit like this. This is Katz's Delicatessen, great pastrami sandwich in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And this is, of course, famous where people come because it's the place where Harry met Sally, and where Sally famously faked it. Now, this faking it, of course, bears some relationship to what I'm going to tell you about the Silicon Valley place. And tourists now come to the precise table where Harry met Sally and Sally faked it, where they enact the entire screenplay. Although what conversations ensue after that screenplay, it doesn't behoove us to think about. And I think that example is useful to keep somewhere in the back of your mind, because these are, like the Katz's Delicatessen, are sites where, so to speak, count as charismatic places. places that are endowed with power because of the memory of things which happened there or which are thought to have happened there. And by the way, Sally was not Sally Ober, but Meg Ryan, and Harry was Billy Crystal. So it doesn't help. You have layered myths in a place like that. And places that are thought maybe to work their magic because of the collective memory of things that happened or that allegedly happened there. Okay, here's the place. It's on the other side of the country. It's Buck's Restaurant. It's in Woodside, California. I'll say something in this talk about Buck's and about what happens or happened there. Then I'll widen the focus a bit towards the end and talk about breakfast, about restaurants and about the modes of interaction that happen in certain kinds of places and over certain kinds of meals, and the historical changes in places and in meals and what happens in places and meals over history. Now, in one respect, this restaurant is nothing special. One VC customer wrote that it looks like it could be the anchor of any upscale retail strip mall in any small town west of the Rockies. All that's missing are hitching posts and a watering trough or two. So its fame in certain circles has got to do with what happened, or to some extent continues to happen. They're not to do with the usual things that might make a restaurant famous, fine cuisine or special things to eat or spectacular views or spectacularly rude waiters. Buck's is open 7 days a week, Christmas and New Year's accepted, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But what makes Buck's famous is breakfast, to a lesser extent lunch, and less commonly dinner, and never at all any meal on the weekend when Buck's is taken over by pelotons of mountain bikers. I mean, you can't park there, can't park your Porsche there because of all the expensive mountain bikes. Now, let's start with the mundane. This is a breakfast menu at Buck's, and you see it's really nothing special. Breakfast here is the usual range of American stuff, Californianized by the addition of the avocado on top of the, that's how you can tell it's California. You can have granola or egg whites if you fear cholesterol, or you can have pancakes or waffles. This is healthy Buck's. You can have all these things in menu. So the prices are nothing particularly unusual for this sort of place. They're a lot more expensive than McDonald's Egg McMuffin. But they're nothing to put off even the most liquidity-constrained Silicon Valley geek. And there are lots of restaurants that serve stuff like that could potentially, and to some extent do, serve as meeting places between VCs and geeks where deals are done. There's the Conditorei Coffee and Pastry Shop in Portola Valley. Steve Jobs used to favor Chef Chu's Chinese restaurant in Los Altos. There's the Coupa Cafe in Palo Alto. And posher, but also, this is the Stanford administrators like this. This is a place I used to go to. This is Il Fornaio in Palo Alto. So what I say about Buck's is perhaps the most legendary, but there are other places where geeks and VCs meet and deals get done. Now, what makes Buck's, and especially breakfast at Buck's, famous are the meetings that have happened there since it opened in 1991. And these are meetings between entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. Meetings which became legendary and mythic because of the deals which are ascribed to this charismatic place. And just like the Harry Met Sally table at Katz's Delicatessen, the patron owner at Buck's is happy to point out for traveling journalists and tourists the exact table where things happen. So, for example, this is the allegedly exact table where John Doerr of the celebrated VC firm Kleiner Perkins met with Mark Andreessen, and the result was Netscape. This is the table where PayPal was brought into being. This is the Hotmail table. And this is the Tesla table. So people come to see these tables and to position themselves at them, and to, if not to reenact the Harry Met Sally passages, at least to partake of something sacred, something techno-scientifically sacred that happened there. Now, after a while, it became impossible for anyone in the business to have breakfast at Buck's without doing a quick survey of who else was having breakfast at Buck's and with whom. So there's a distinction that you find in Irving Goffman, of which more later, between eye shot and earshot. And there's a certain amount of bonhomie amongst the people. The VCs may not want to be overheard by other VCs when they're having these tete-a-tete meetings, but there's a certain amount of table hopping, glad handing, shaking hands. In the morning, it said, especially, there's a lot of table hopping and handshaking. It's like Facebook with real faces, the owner said. It's famous throughout the world, so the Daily Telegraph in Britain breathlessly announced that at Bucks, quote, more deals are struck between those with money, cash-rich venture capitalists, and those wanting it, cash-hungry entrepreneurs, than in all of America's other restaurants combined. So if you're an out-of-town journalist, and there are hundreds of them, and you want to take the pulse of the Valley, you go to Bucks. And if Bucks is busy, and if there's buzz around Bucks, then the Valley is good. If Bucks is empty, or if there are Ford Focuses as opposed to Mercedes in the car park, then the Valley is not good. And tourists come to Bucks, and aspiring entrepreneurs come to Bucks, where they lurk outside in the car park with photo identikits of famous venture capitalists, hoping to leap upon them with a business plan. So you've got a certain amount of crowd control that you have to do at Bucks. And Bucks has been called, in a gesture to the Wheaties commercial, the breakfast spot of champions. It has buzz. The VC, Bill Draper, said that Bucks is the distillation of much of what is so odd, special, and compelling about the Valley, a place where great ideas meet smart money. So it's a mythic place. It's a real place, but it's a mythic place where, on the one hand, participants talk about Bucks as a place where myths were born, in other words, Netscape, Tesla, PayPal, in the sense that the companies which resulted from, or allegedly resulting from, these breakfasts at Bucks become part of Valley myth. On the other hand, it's mythic in the sense that assigning these companies to a particular breakfast or set of breakfasts at Bucks is intensely problematic. That's in the nature of myth. Now, in one sense or another, these meetings or breakfasts like them almost certainly did happen, though it's impossible to ascribe any one company to any single meeting. But the myths become, as it were, recursive. They reflect upon each other, so that now when you have a meeting at Bucks, you're aware that you're having a meeting at Bucks. It's a bit like, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Oh, this is where, that sort of thing. Okay, to get more concrete, why Bucks? In the beginning, in the early 1990s, there was probably only one pertinent reason why Bucks, and that is, as the real estate people say, location, location, location. I don't know if you can see that, but that's the I-280. And the little Google marker is Bucks in Woodside, so it's just a few hundred yards off of I-280. And if you follow that road down south, the first turning to the left is Sand Hill Road, above that green thing, which is Stanford University, and the VC's offices are almost all on Sand Hill Road. So that if you're a VC and you're coming to work either from the south, from Los Altos or Los Gatos, or coming from the north, from San Francisco, it's an easy turn off. So it's an easy place to meet. So there's no particular reason why Bucks in the beginning, except for location. It could have been any number of different places, but after a while, the reason it was Bucks is because it was Bucks. In other words, because of the historically real accretion of myth, so that if you were an entrepreneur and you were invited by a VC to breakfast at Bucks, you knew it was showtime. You knew what it signified that you were invited to Bucks. There's probably another reason. Bob Metcalf, the entrepreneur who founded 3Com and the Ethernet, probably had a lot to do with it in 1992, just a year after Bucks opened, when he wrote in his weekly InfoWorld column that Bucks was the new power breakfast spot for Silicon Valley. I should actually say something about the idea of power breakfasts, and maybe in questions you can ask me about that. And in the same year, The Economist in England mentioned Bucks as the place where all these things. So within a year, it becomes the place. So from 1992, 1991, into the present breakfast at Buck's. You did it with the consciousness that this was Buck's that you were having breakfast at. So that's what you did. And if you were a VC and if you wanted to put an entrepreneur on his or her mettle, you said, let's meet at Buck's for breakfast. So by the end of the 1990s, at least, VCs and entrepreneurs breakfasted at Buck's because that's what you did when you were at the early stages of deal making. It became famous for these sorts of meetings, and very quickly, because this is the height of the Silicon Valley boom, journalists and camera crews came to record the place where the modern world was brought into being. And you'll see they use this sort of rhetoric, where the modern techno-scientific world is brought into being. The breakfast that launched Hotmail had to be reenacted for CNN, and when a Japanese television crew came to do the same story, the owner, an interesting man I'll talk about called James McNiven, let them shoot a still photograph of the reenactment that he already had on the wall. So this is one turn above the Harry Met Sally story. McNiven himself, as the owner, patron of Buck's, has been repeatedly interviewed as if he was part of the secret and in on the secret, as if he himself had become wealthy through overhearing and participating in these deals, as if he himself could fix up a meeting with you with a VC, none of which is true, even if McNiven says that he was asked to sit in on a number of pitches, and as we'll mention, he parlayed his proprietorship into TED Talk celebrity. You can see McNiven, don't do it now, in his Hawaiian shirt, talking about the technological future on the TED Talk. Now, Buck's menu, when you go to there for breakfast, this is McNiven in the shirt doing a TED Talk. But when you go to Buck's, before you open up the menu with the egg whites, no cholesterol, and granola, you're folded into a 2-page newsletter written by McNiven where he speculates about the technological future. So you get, in other words, McNiven as a techno guru, as a futurology, together with your breakfast menu, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And he's very self-conscious about his role in all of this. He one of the most interviewed personalities of the Valley. Page 2. He brags that since 1995, we have had over 600 TV, radio, glossy print, and fish wrapper press come to Buck's to speak with me and my customers. He says, I'm only the second biggest press whore in America, ceding first place to Donald Trump. So that's a distant second. And McNiven has been called both the mayor of Silicon Valley and the prime minister of Silicon Valley, as if you would say Madame de Staël was in charge of the French Enlightenment. This is McNiven. We invented the modern world. We are where the modern world is emerging from. We are really the new Athens. And some entrepreneurs agree. They say, at Buck's rustic tables, the information era was forged, and here the next revolution will happen, the transition to Green Valley, or the birth of the clean tech revolution. As favorite customer, as the venture capitalist Bill Draper, recently wrote a book about Silicon Valley startups, not a bad book. And the first part of this book was entitled Breakfast at Buck's. So it's not just James McNiven's egoism, it's a distributed myth. And a German entrepreneur came to Silicon Valley, and he wrote a book, first in German and then in English, celebrating the informality and the openness and the eccentricity of Buck's with the stodgy jam in the restaurants. So it became, for the German entrepreneur, a kind of anti-Germany. There's a little bit of this going around here about this is the anti-Russia as well. This is certainly the anti-Germany. And he said, if you wanted to show a German idea how innovation happens, take them to Buck's, he said. McNiven himself produced a self-published self-celebration called Breakfast at Buck's, where it's kind of like, Mel Brooks, Me and My Peppy Ways. style, about how he made the information revolution, about Silicon Valley utopianism in general. And he's a great character in a Silicon Valley that's full of great characters playing great characters. Now, VCs and the other customers say that Buck's at Woodside, the Buck's restaurant, is the most unlikely venue for serious business. They say the dress code is dressed down, a suit and tie stands out like a sore thumb. Now, I should say something about the suit and tie reference, because as I'm sure many of you will know, and don't shoot the messenger, 89% of VCs and 96% of senior partners in VC firms are male, as are the vast proportion of entrepreneurs in which they invest. And this is, of course, of much hostility and to some extent to remedy the situation. But I'm going to confront this essentially because this is a story about boys, importantly, a story about boys. But when you go inside Buck's, you see immediately, and I want to take you inside Buck's, that it's an even more unlikely place than the VC said for serious business to take place. Or, and I think this is the correct story, from the right point of view, this is a very likely place for Silicon Valley business to take place. It's a very likely place for techno-scientific future-making, visionary, often utopian stuff, business without a template, but very much surrounded by an aura of mythic self-consciousness. Buck's is intentionally designed to be just the right setting, and I'm going to use the Goffmanian notion of setting or stage setting for private capital meets techno-scientific entrepreneurship. It's a stage set for the theater of the future. Now, Buck's decor, what counts as its decor, is a mashup of whatever took McNiven's fancy over 20 years of collecting. Some call it Western kitsch. McNiven says it's American wacky and a collection of life's ironic magic. Others call it a phantasmagoria of boy toys. And the VC said that it resembles what the Smithsonian warehouse might look like in the wake of a tornado as straightened up by the Mad Hatter, which is his way of saying that he really liked it. So let's take you in. Oh, first the car park. The first thing you see when you park your Porsche there is a 20-foot long carving of a fish called Woody. And again, a lot of people pose on Woody too. If you do your Googling now, you'll see people posing on Woody. But there's a lot more inside. Here's the inside. Here's McNiven, the owner. And there you see a famous, enormous ketchup bottle and a lot of the kitsch with which he surrounds himself. These are model airplanes. There's more tchotchkes on the wall. This Statue of Liberty actually holds an ice cream sundae instead of a torch. And there's more of this sort of stuff inside. This is a wonderful California personalized license plate. Google. If you can't read it, I was too dumb to buy the stock, but I bought the license plate. And then you have this sort of thing, the world's largest Swiss Army knife. Remember, bigger is better in all things. Now, there's weirder stuff than that, and I hadn't realized when I was writing this that I was going to be giving this talk here, but there's a story about a visiting Russian general, and I've Googled this, and this Leonid Ivashov is a real Russian.
He's famous for his conservative views.
Interesting. But the story about a visiting Russian general, he's breakfasting Buck with the just retired U.S. Secretary of Defense, was Bill Perry, who left behind a business card, and I'll show you the business card, saying to McNiven, "If you're ever in Russia, please look me up." McNiven goes to Russia and looks him up. But the general, for some reason, is otherwise engaged in Chechnya. But the staff at the Ministry of Defense guide McNiven to a place that manufactures the Russian cosmonaut suits, which McNiven is in search of, as a tchotchke. And McNiven manages actually to buy it. This is a Yuri Gagarin model that hangs from the ceiling of Buck's. Talk about pathetic. But there's another story. That's nothing compared to the chutzpah in an attempt by McNiven to buy another valuable Russian tchotchke in 1993. It was an attempt that failed, but the failure itself has become a Buck's knick-knack, and here it is. These are the business cards of Leonid Ivashov. In the middle, as you can see, Ivashov visited Buck's, and McNiven had the idea that maybe the post-Soviet government would be looking to turn a profit on Lenin's, now surplus to requirements, embalmed body. So he wrote to a Russian official, and this is the letter, offering, quote, a sum in the low six figures for Lenin's body. The body to be displayed in Buck's restaurant in Woodside, California. This is crazy. He got a reply, and this is the reply. Again, it's tragic. This is the reply. We are piqued by your request for the buying of the body of Lenin. We have not been in consideration of a selling of Lenin's body as of today. The next line is great. Tell us what is exactly meant by low six figures. Without this understanding, I cannot discuss this anymore. You will be pleased that this negotiation came to nothing, but it's rather an amazing sort of exchange.
Basically says this is a fake letter.
No! Can you document this for me?
No, but it has grammatical mistakes by definition, and the header is basically just says it's a joke, it's a hoax.
McNiven does not know this, so I will personally write to McNiven.
Maybe he knows.
He wouldn't care, but he should know, because this is reproduced.
He shouldn't show it to any diplomat. They will laugh themselves to death.
This is a wonderful story. This is the best comment that I've ever had.
Also, you should know that Ivashov was one of the most belligerent generals in the general headquarters of the Russian army, always presuming that the détente and the perestroika were American ruses to destroy Russia. So why he would end up in Bucks? Well, Perry might have been his, he's a kind of diehard nationalist. I mean, he's the banner of nationalist military.
Maybe Perry was a spy.
Just like avocado in the omelet.
I think this is a wonderful moment. But there is a point to be made, and the decor, the stage setting that McNiven describes as stage setting of eccentricity. This is the most eccentric of all the eccentricities, but it plays its part in a kind of mise en place of eccentricities in Buck's restaurant. Now, the owner himself is part of the show. The owner himself is an eccentric prop. He's part of the stage set for the Valley Theater of Innovation. He sees himself that way. He revels in being the restaurateur for the future, and he's equipped Bucks with the boy toy props for the role. He says, if you go to the website, don't do it now, Bucks is the Earth-linked mothership for the New Jerusalem. So you get these wonderful messianic, technological, utopian sentiments. He says that he hasn't profited from overheard investment trips, but he's a bit of an entrepreneur himself. He's got lots of restaurants in the Bay Area, and he's made a series of investments, including one in a robotics firm. He says, I'm always coupled in articles with Alan Greenspan as America's top pundits. Now, if you think the joke has gone far enough, in last year in June, he was invited with 130 kind of Davos boys on a British Airways 747 flying from San Francisco to London. And while in the air, they were supposed to come up with a mission to change the world. So a ship of fools, as it were, and a ship of nerds on the British Airways plane, and McNiven was one of them. In other words, taken seriously. I mean, he's at Davos, and he does it too. So he's, in other words, he's realized himself at a very interesting level. And the boundary between craziness and eccentricity, as every Valley person knows, is difficult to discern and difficult to police. But he's an eccentric, he's a hippie of a particular Californian sort. The sort that, sometimes I say that some of them turned north at Golden Gate Park and went to Marin County to found organic farming mantra chanting communities, and others turned south and built the internet and the personal computer. And often, as the case of Steve Jobs, they were the same person. So McNiven belongs a bit to that world. He was a self-described student activist and leftist radical at Berkeley, and he says, in disproof that if you were alive in the 60s, then you can't remember it. The 60s were cool. He was an artist. He trained in New York in the art world. He tried to make it in the New York art world and failed. He came back to first to Iowa and then to California as a builder. And the reason that Steve Jobs never went to Buck's restaurant is that McNiven was the builder of his house in Woodside, California, or the rebuilder of his house in Woodside, and he made a mess of it. And you know, Steve Jobs had a terrible temper. And so Steve Jobs would never mention his name or go to Buck's a restaurant. So Buck's is McNiven's place, but it's an inventory place that has designed to make Valley innovators feel at home. And I think the idea of the stage setting or the props for innovation are actually the right ones. Okay, more concreteness. What happens at the breakfasts? Now, the breakfasts are, of course, informal, so that what actually goes on at these meetings is a matter of anecdote and gossip, and we have some, but not a lot of anecdote or gossip. I mean, I've had breakfasts with VCs and entrepreneurs, and I can triangulate through that. Of course, the meetings are not minuted. Of course, they're not minuted, and that's rather the point. Most breakfasts, and probably the overwhelming majority of breakfasts, don't have any outcome at all. So this is the table where Netscape was born. Most breakfasts don't come to anything, and the stories get told about the few breakfasts that do come to something. The breakfasts are not supposed to be pitches from the entrepreneur, but the entrepreneur understands that if he or she is invited to breakfast at Buck's, he better come with the pitch, the elevator pitch or the 10-minute pitch ready, in case that it is called for, and the business plan either on the iPad or the laptop. So it's informal. You know, the VC may say, just talk to me, answer this question, but it's formally informal. In other words, there's certain things that you know will be asked, and there's certain responses that you are expected to give. So a commentator who pretends to know about Buck's breakfast conversations writes that they sound disjointed, normless, conventionless. Speakers hop from one topic to the next, interrupting each other while the entrepreneur sketches on a napkin and the VC makes notes on a ketchup-stained placemat to be taken back to his office. And slowly a pattern emerges. The VCs are probing, they're probing again. What appears aimless and patternless takes shapes as inquiry. What's the product? Who's the customer? How much will this cost? What's the competition? What's the security of the intellectual property? Now, success at a meeting like this would be a further meeting, maybe for coffee at the VC's offices at Sand Hill Road, maybe eventually a long time down the road a pitch to the general partners at the VC's office. But this is usually stage one for the meeting. These are very preliminary. Now, the meetings are informal, but they're intimate. And they're intimate in a very obvious nose in the front of your face sort of way. Because as at any breakfast, the supplicant and the capitalist are just a few feet away from each other. They're in face-to-face, eye-to-eye contact, called high bandwidth contact for the 40 minutes or hour that the breakfast takes place. And of course, if we think about it, shared meals are important, perhaps the most important sites for all sorts of social relationships, including intimate social relationships, or the celebration of group identity regiments, college fellowships, etc. to take place. We build society as we feed each other at every sort of level in our society. So the question is, what sort of interaction, what sort of society or potential society is being built there? And for that 40 minutes or hour, the VC is literally looking the future in the face and monitoring the face for all sorts of high bandwidth information. Now, affect is probably involved too. VCs say, not entirely disingenuously, that they like to like the people with whom they're going to form a relationship. The relationship between VC and entrepreneur, if successful, may last anywhere from 3 to 7 years, longer in the case of biotech. It's not like a banker gives you a loan and then goes away. So there's a lot of talk about affect, there's a lot of talk about personal relationships, especially after the deal is concluded, but they're also monitoring every aspect of that relationship for passion, integrity, just as, the question and answer moment, which I used to despise, but now I see the point of in academic meetings. You're probing and probing again to see if there's more in the tank. In other words, if people can respond intelligently and in an informed way when the pressure is on, not just in reading a paper, which is a legitimate thing to want to know, and VCs want to know about this. And so VCs say this is where the action is, and a lot of the action is had by face-to-face. More concrete, the food. Eating, because you're talking and eating, and you can't talk and eat at the same time, but eating is happening. The owner, McNiven, shared with a journalist an observation on what money eats for breakfast. He said, if you're looking for a guide to deal spotting, do not look at the French toast munchers. The bigger the deal, the less they eat, because you don't want your mouth full at a critical moment. The serious venture capitalists, you say, eat muffins. So when my wife goes to these breakfasts, and she always eats muffins, I said, but you don't like muffins. I just now realized why she eats muffins. Now, the high bandwidth of the face-to-face mode has for many years been supplemented by another sort of scene with which we are intimately familiar. And this is said to be, by McNiven, and may be the first place where you have an intimate form of face-to-face relationship in which you're also in a cyber relationship with the rest of the world, because Bucks is said to be the first place offering free Wi-Fi in a public place. Now, this may or may not be true, but here's a scene which it is said was first experienced at Bucks, and now we've grown used to as, of course, that's a laptop. Now we would all have smartphones and iPods, but it is said, and I'll continue to try to find out about this, that Bucks may be the first place where a scene like that actually happened. If you want to get fancy about it, Bucks may have been one of the first of this type of heterotopic space. In other words, a space where we ask, what is happening? And the answer is both intimacy and a kind of opposite of intimacy, which and then a new kind of recursive intimacy, where you can be in analog face-to-face relationship with your entrepreneur and in digital contact with the universe. So that's a normal mode of interaction now, but it is said that Bucks is the first place where this happened. Okay, let me try to, now I'm an historian, so let me try to think historically about places like this, and I've also been concerned for some time with food and eating, so I come to this interested in breakfast. So let me try to pull back a bit and talk about what kind of thing breakfast is and what kind of things restaurants are. Bucks is a meal in a restaurant. We now take for granted that there are such things as restaurants, but there didn't used to be restaurants. There didn't used to be conventions for behaving in restaurants or modes of being or interaction in a restaurant. But there's been a lot of really good recent scholarship. I'm thinking particularly of Rebecca Spang's book on the invention of the restaurant in late 18th century, early 19th century Paris, that draws attention to the historical origins of a place called a restaurant, and its significance as a mode of modernity, because what Rebecca Spang is calling attention to are forms of interaction which became, as it were, conventional and normative in a restaurant, which were essentially not available before, which we now take for granted. Now, there's several points to bear in mind here, and the first thing, this is a early 19th century French restaurant, is the carte, or the menu. I showed you the Bucks menu, but we now take for granted when we go to a restaurant that we order off the carte, or the menu. We order à la carte, which is to say we have a very large range of choices, and we get to have what we want. And of course, this is in opposition by a traditional joint eating place, the table d'hôte, where the host offers a table of set things, a trenchers passed around. People bring their knives and their spoons, and they take what they want from it's become newly fashionable. Le Pain Quotidien, for example, in New York City, And now at the top of the American restaurant thing is somehow the reimportation of communal eating with a limited range of choices. But the restaurant, including the restaurant in Bucks, typically is where you have what you want with your party, with the person that you're having interaction to. So this is a new way of being, and the menu, following the views of Rebecca Spang, represents a form of individualism, a manifestation of the power of the individual consumer. I will have what I want, and I will have what I want either by myself or as a separate party in a public space, but in a separate party with other people. And the second and the related point is the form of social interaction conventional in the restaurant. It was one of the places where you could be, arguably for the first time, alone together. So we have to think about this because, again, we take it for granted. So each party is in intimate face-to-face contact with its own members while disengaged from others who are also in the restaurant. Even those sitting at adjacent tables. Now in California, they may say, hi, my name is Martin, or a fork may appear, can I taste this, like that. But usually it doesn't happen, and certainly doesn't happen on the East Coast. So you're alone together. Other people are together. They're all ordering off the cart. You may be in earshot of them. You're certainly an eyeshot of them, but they become irrelevant because you've created a space of intimacy in a public space. Now consider the difference from, say, the modern cinema or the theater or the concert, all of which, including the cinema, have lineages back into the pre-modern past, where one is alone together. So if you go to a cinema, you may go alone, you may go with your relevant other, but you're experiencing the same thing, and the reaction of others who you may not know, who you certainly will not know, to the thing that you're experiencing together as part of your experience. In other words, try going to a comedy alone. It's not funny. So the experience of being alone together is really a very interesting feature of restaurants as a mode of modernity. Okay, Bucks is a restaurant. On these breakfasts, I've drawn attention to our meals in a restaurant. Now, one of the virtues of a meeting at Bucks is sometimes said that it's neutral territory. The VC is not inviting you to his home. He's not inviting you to his offices. But it's not the VC's offices, and that adds to a deniability that a commitment is being made, that a relationship is actually being formed. And as Bucks is a restaurant, neither the VC nor the entrepreneur, of course, owns this place, but it's not entirely neutral because the VC is the host. The VC has selected the restaurant. And although I have absolutely no evidence of this, I am morally certain that the VC picks up the tab, pays the bill. And that's what you do when you're the host. I would imagine if an entrepreneur attempted to pay the bill, the VC would be both puzzled and or offended. The VC will be in charge of the meeting. This is when the meeting begins, and the VC will be in charge of when the meeting ends. I have to go to the offices now. So it's a neutral place, but it's a place which is a stage set for the venture capitalist. The venture capitalist controls in a very interesting way. And it contains, as Irving Goffman, again, might have said, it contains the capitalist props. I think McNiven has been a genius at supplying the props for Silicon Valley, the theater of innovation in Silicon Valley. Now, the identity of all daily meals in history has been historically unstable. It's been unstable with respect to what's eaten in meals. I'm talking about deep history now. It's been unstable with respect to when the meals are taken. It's been unstable with respect to where the meals are taken, with whom they're taken, and what they signify, and the kinds of things that are done at meals. Dinner, for example, has historically been understood as the main meal of the day. Dinner is still the main meal of the day. But in the 17th century, dinner was noontime. And it crept over the 19th century into mid-afternoon and then into late afternoon, and finally, as in places like Madrid, until like breakfast the next day. It's so late. Supper, historically, was traditionally a little something that you took, maybe soup, maybe bread and cheese, before going to bed. And even now in Britain, I lived in Britain a long time, what's called dinner, what's called supper, and what's called tea varies in timing, content, in mode of service, and in social identity between social classes and regional cultures. So when you're when you're not sure of what social setting you're in, or when you're an expatriate, such as I was, and you're invited over for tea in the north of England or in Scotland, you really don't know what it is going to happen. In Scotland, tea means your evening meal. In the north of England, it probably means your evening meal. In the south of England, it means you're going to have a cup of tea and some cakes. And this is also a class-based sort of thing. So there's all instability in what meals are in general. Now, breakfast. Well, breakfast is interesting because for most of European history, breakfast as a routine morning meal did not exist. The English word breakfast was apparently not invented, according to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, until the middle of the 15th century. And a morning meal of solid food was normally not taken, or if it was restricted to the very young, the very old, the invalid, or to the laboring classes who are either weak or needed solid food as sustenance before going off to work, at 7 or 8 in the morning. But if you took solid food at 7 or 8 or 9 in the morning, you reckon a special explanation for doing that. Dinner was itself a contraction of the Latin word for breaking the fast, disjejunare. Hence both the English word breakfast and the French petit déjeuner etymologically duplicated the idea of breaking the night's fast, so encoding the anomaly of a morning meal of solid food. Now, in 17th century London, the best source we have for the quotidian eating together is Samuel Pepys's diary, which I've read religiously. He recorded that he did take breakfast. The diary lasts about 9-10 years. Only 5 times does he mention he took breakfast. But what he took for breakfast was, again, very unstable. Sometimes it was mackerel, sometimes it was a collar of brawn or bacon, and certainly wasn't eggs or toast. Much more often what Pepys says is that he gave someone what he called the morning draft, which was either small beer or wine or chocolate or coffee. But he gave someone their morning draft. And the morning draft served a social function. It was taken in the commercial establishment. You would go somewhere to give someone the morning draft. You treated someone else to it. You bought someone their morning draft. And it was an occasion where you did deals. And Pepys will always talk about giving someone their morning draft and doing deals. You can think of Samuel Pepys, who is a very important Admiralty naval official, as doing deals over what we would call breakfast, but it was the morning draft in the 17th century. Now, when you move into the 20th century, breakfast did become a common feature of both European and American life, but its identity into the 20th century and to the present remains far more problematic than any other meal, and therefore it's a kind of blank canvas for all kinds of social relationships, including innovation in social relationships. So advertisers and nutritionists in the States will assure us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. But many people don't take breakfast at all. Well, others have it on the run, they have it in their car, or they pick it up on their way to the office. And what you have for breakfast is also problematic, though probably not quite as problematic as that newer American invention, which is now infecting the world, brunch. What is brunch? Interesting question. So at Bucks, one person at a table may be having coffee and toast, while another opts for the South Bay equivalent of the full English breakfast, fried bacon, fried sausage, fried eggs, fried toast, tomato, fried tomato. Sorry, I just infected by my English wife. Think of the tomato and the tomato as 2 different things. For some people that do have breakfast, it's a social occasion, though unless it's an institutional power breakfast or prayer breakfast, a non-solitary breakfast is usually a diet. If you look around those scenes in Bucks, it's usually one-on-one. Or if it's collective breakfast, it's sort of Rotarian, or it's some institutional function. So the norms of breakfast have been and continue to be uncertain but it's often a more intimate occasion than other meals. I think of intimate personal relations where, you know, there's a dating service called It's Just Lunch, implying we don't want to make a commitment, because dinner in a movie may imply what happens afterwards. But in an intimate relationship, when you're having breakfast together, it's, you know, it's just before the walk of shame. It's the most intimate occasion. Here you got an inversion, where breakfast is the least intimate of the forms of relationship in this world. Then there's the fact, the obvious in front of you, notice the fact that it's a morning meal, and not just a morning meal, but a meal taken outside of and prior to a working day. On weekdays, Bucks opens at 7 a.m. This appalls Brits and French people I know. Plenty of time to get to Sand Hill Road by 9 a.m. So unlike lunch, it doesn't take time out from the working day, but it precedes the working day. It's outside of the working day. In other words, no one sees you go to breakfast. Everyone sees you go if you go to lunch. By the time a VC meets you for breakfast, if you're an entrepreneur, he may have been up for 3 hours, having already done his email, done Tai Chi or worked out with his personal trainer and spent, 12 seconds of personal quality time with his kids. But these are up with the lark competitive people. So by a 7 a.m. breakfast, these people have been up for, they've been up for God knows how long. As a VC, you may take lunch with other VCs at your firm or other firms, or with the limited partners, say pension fund managers who provide the capital that you manage, or you may brown bag your lunch at your desk. But breakfast is your business. Or if you prefer, it's not business at all, unless you otherwise define it. If you're a supplicant entrepreneur and you're lucky enough to be offered breakfast at Bucks with a VC, you understand that you may be a very long way from a pitch in the VC offices, and a longer way from lunch with the VC and his partners, and a very long way from dinner, because the VC will have dinner with the entrepreneur after the deal has been done. That's a celebration. That's when you meet the partners, both the intimate partners and the general partners in the fund. It's a celebration of a consummated relationship. So breakfast is the opposite of dinner in terms of the scale of social relationships. But for our purposes, the important thing is that it's outside of the working day, and it's open as a blank canvas to be anything you want it to be. So it's an ideal stage setting for what happens there. There's also the local circumstance that breakfast, and to a lesser extent lunch, have in America, and especially in California, few local alternatives as occasions for the sort of interaction that's represented by the famous Bucks scenes. Intimacy with informality, out of the routines of the working day, interacting one-on-one, but in a public place, in neutral territory, but a place in which one party can act as host. So it is an available space for the kind of thing which is radically unavailable in the United States and in modernity more generally. Here's an example of a space which has been celebrated as the origin of modes of modernity. This is a London coffee house in the middle of the 17th century, and what you see here is a place in which news is posted on the boards, newspapers around, but this is a common table. This is Le Pain Quotidien in Manhattan, where people are at, this is a table d'hôte of the public sphere, in which people are seated in intimate relationship with others. All sorts of people come to coffee, and sort of Jürgen Habermas has celebrated the coffee house as the spatial origins of much of the public sphere. It's a place where you would go to hear news and to make news, but it was not the sort of place where you could be alone together, which was called the modern mode, since the whole point of the early modern coffee house was its common table, which was, after all, where you heard the news and spread the gossip. At the same time, again in 17th century cities like London, the tavern, the inn, the alehouse were typically places where you might engage yourself with others in common, or if you wanted privacy for confidential business or sexual purposes, where you could secure a private room. You still find some of these places in the American South, where private rooms are available as well as public spaces, where only the owner and the staff pledged to secrecy, like the upper servants in Downton Abbey, would know that you were there and with whom you were. Now, modern America is short of places like that. Short of places that makes breakfast at Buck's famous. It doesn't have this sort of place, which is a pub. This is an Irish pub, the British or Irish pub, where if you can hear yourself over the noise and if you're sober enough, great thing about coffee, of course, is you don't get drunk. But where a public place where people can have conversation, not just with intimate others, but with whoever they want to have a conversation. America has very few places of that sort. America does, as we now know, have coffee houses, but increasingly as places where you are connected to the world, but not to anyone sitting with you. And this is a typical scene, a rather frightening scene that you'll recognize. This is Starbucks. So again, this is a heterotypic place, but these typically you have scenes where people are alone, but not alone together. They're just alone and connected to the rest of the world. When Starbucks threatened to become something like a Viennese coffee house, where people, I was interested in terms of the anti-cafe, maybe we can have that. When Starbucks threatened to become a place where people, as it were, plugged in their laptops and spent all day drinking one latte, the national ownership took steps to move on the, quote, loitering laptop hobos. Customers were not to confuse a business with a public place, and the police were called in to make that clearly understood. So this is, as it were, an increasingly commonplace in America, but it's a failed place because Starbucks is a business, coffee houses are business. And whereas I was just having a conversation with someone in a Viennese coffee shop, you knew through just the conventions and norms, a certain amount of coffee, a certain number of Sacher tortas have to be eaten as you spend the day, and because that's the deal, no one had to enforce it. The police didn't have to be called in. But these are people who don't buy any coffee and don't buy any pastry, and so it's an interesting sort of tension there. So let me conclude by saying breakfast is interesting. Breakfast is that usually unremarked on, remarkable thing. It's an occasion that combines informality with intimacy, that isn't business, but isn't not business, that belongs to the concerns of the working day, but that's set outside of the working day, that signifies anything you want it to be, or nothing at all. It's cultural and social instability. In the case of Buck's, its relative normlessness makes it just the perfect stage setting for innovation to happen. So this kind of area I hadn't realized. I apologize for not talking about hacker spaces and garages and kitchens, but this is, breakfast at Buck's is quite an interesting site, and the search for places where communication can happen within a set of norms and normlessness is something which was happened upon in the case of Silicon Valley, in a setting where there are very few alternatives to them. And what will happen as the American coffee house becomes corporatized and controlled is I wish the anti-cafe well for the sake of American innovation. Thank you.